Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Isabel, especially for inviting me to come and talk to you today. You'll have to excuse me for referring to my notes throughout the talk because I want to put a lot of detailed information to you and I want to make sure I get it right, so I don't want to just ad lib. A couple of explanations. Geomorphology is the study of landform processes, and paleopaleontology, which is a subdiscipline of paleobotany, is the study of fossilized pollen grains. Both of those areas can help build our knowledge of past environments, and that's what I want to focus on today, is to share with you a lot of the research that we've done that throws light on what is the history of the environment that we currently enjoy with here today. I've chosen the time frame of 25,000 years mainly because it encompasses major environmental changes that lie behind the present day ecology of the region. All of us managing our properties for conservation see them as special and worth the effort of restoring and preserving them. And they are special. Many contain remnant rainforest, which is now a highly fragmented environment, and it's been reduced to a small fraction of its scale before clearing in the 19th and 20th centuries. They're special also because they often contain characteristics that aren't well represented in the government reserve system. This is largely because they occur as remnants in and adjoining areas that were subdivided and cleared for agriculture because of their soils and topography, while only the less appealing areas remained uncleared and available for management as state forests or national parks. Having spent 25 years now getting the natural environment on my property back on its feet, the period of my management is now half over, and securing its future is a priority. I think very few of us would be content to see all our work come to nothing after just enjoying a private botanic garden for a few years. That's why in perpetuity covenants in instruments such as VCAs are so important. But in perpetuity is a long time. This is where the record of long-term change is so valuable to us. It shows us not just what happened and when, but the dynamics of the changes. I want to provide an overview of the record built from two sites in the region today, Myall Lake and Barrington Tops, and an additional site just outside the region. This axis is showing the three sites that I want to look at today. Myall Lake, down here in the right-hand corner, in the centre, Barrington Tops, and up to the northwest is a site many of you will never have heard of called Gorin Lake. That's about 140 kilometres northwest of Barrington Tops. The reason I've chosen the three locations is because to get the whole picture, we can't just draw on the evidence from one site because none of them have a complete record. So I needed the three sites to try to get a full record. This is Gorin Lake. It's a shallow freshwater lake, roughly the same size as Myall Lake. It's not well known, mainly because it lies entirely on privately owned properties. So there is essentially no public access to this lake, but it is big. It's as big as Myall Lake. The sedimentary environment at Gorin Lake wasn't favourable to the preservation of pollen, essentially because it was alkaline. So it wasn't possible for me to ascertain changes in vegetation there other than by inference from the changes in climatic and hydrological conditions. Here, the main records of past environmental conditions are found in the geomorphic features, the landform features around the lake. In one location around the lake shores, there are remnants of a deposit of a material called tufa. It's calcium carbonate cemented beach material. This slide is showing a cross-section, a very thin slice cut through a sample of the tufa. The dark, see if where's my pointer? That one? Yeah. These dark bits are sand grains, primarily quartz sand. The brown is a clay matrix, but the white fringing bits are the interesting stuff. That's the crystals of calcium carbonate. And being carbonate means we can subject it to carbon dating. We know that the conditions at the time to produce this required the lake to be supersaturated with salts, including calcium carbonate. Hence, the beaches got cemented with this material. This tufa I dated as being 27,000 years old. The shorthand is 27,000 BP, so I might lapse into that through the talk. BP simply means before the present. It's shorthand for saying years ago. So 27,000 years BP, we had at Gorin Lake high lake salinities with an excess of evaporation over freshwater inputs to the lake. Now this date is interesting because it just precedes the peak of the last glacial maximum, commonly known as the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, when average land temperatures in Australia were around 4 to 11 degrees lower than today, and there was significant glaciation in Tasmania and in the Snowy Mountains area, but not up as far as Barrington Tops. There would have been persistent patches of snow, but not glaciers and ice up in this area. Other shoreline calcareous materials that I dated returned ages of 17,500 years, so getting more recent, and that indicated a saline lake environment at that time as well. Now on the eastern side of the main lake basin, you'll see this large crescent shape here, this massive material in the middle of the lake and a very crescent-shaped shoreline there. That's actually, that mass in the middle is actually built from several large transverse, meaning crossways, linear clay dunes. They're 2.5 kilometres long and they rise 13.5 metres above the surrounding lake bed, so they're big dunes. They're currently inactive and they're orientated east-northeast, west-southwest. The material the dunes are built from isn't sand, but it's pelleted aggregates of clay and silt, hence commonly known as a clay dune. There are clay dunes further west out round Willandra Lakes, but they tend to be crescent-shaped dunes, not transverse parallel dunes as they are at Gorin Lake. Under conditions of high salinity and frequent wetting and drying, the clays around the shoreline effloresce, they fluff up from the salt, and the paletal aggregates accumulate on the downwind side of the lake margin. That just means the wind picks up these little pellets of clay, rolls them along and then blows them up into the dune. Another cross section, this is one of the clay pellets that the dune is built from. So both, I've dated the main periods of dune building here as 21,500 BP, and that continued through to 18 or 19,000 years ago. And then there was a second period of renewed dune building at 8,500 years BP. Both of those dune building phases indicate a cold, dry environment with very strong prevailing westerly winds that were blowing huge volumes of clay out from the lake bed and shores and building these clay dunes. For the people living there at the time, and of course there were given these dates, conditions would have been pretty tough and miserable, freezing cold, bone dry and howling westerly winds. Now, very recent research by some people at the Uni of Wollongong have questioned the long-standing view that the last glacial maximum was very cold and dry and windy across much of Australia. They think maybe it was seasonally dry rather than dry all year round, but I'm only going to focus today on the conditions at these sites rather than attempt to look at other regions. So the next site I want to look at on our axis is Myall Lake, right down this southeastern end of that axis. I'm sure over here most, or if not all of us, will be quite familiar with Myall Lake. Now, much of the geomorphic history of the near coastal environment, essentially from Newcastle northwards up to Seal Rocks, was established by a colleague of mine, Bruce Thom. So the research behind these findings wasn't my work, although I helped to a minor extent on some of the field trips to the area. This is a shot of Myall Lake today, as we will all be familiar with it. This is an area, it won't be too clear for those of you in the back of the room, but I want to point out a few features of this which are very telling in terms of what's been happening with environmental change in the region over the time frame we're looking at. I don't know if you can make them out, but through this area here at the back around Mungo Brush, there are parallel stripes in the landform, and there's also a little boggy patch in the middle, which is called a back barrier lagoon. With sea level falling and then rising again, material that had been out on the continental shelf gets pushed ashore, and it forms what's called the outer and inner barriers. So at Myall Lakes, the inner barrier is this landform mass in here where you can see the big ridges. And that was built probably at the last glacial phase before the most recent one, so it could be 80,000 years old. But this is called the outer barrier. It's the most recent one. And when it pushed up, there was this swampy little bit left between the two barriers. Now, those two barriers, inner and outer, were established by a mix of marine and wind-blown processes. But the important thing to realise here is that at the last glacial maximum, 18 to 21,000 years ago, the sea level was 120 metres lower than at present. So the shoreline off Mungo Brush was 15 kilometres to the east of where it is today, with a vast coastal plain exposed. The lake systems, Smiths Lake, Myall Lake, were established by earlier sea level changes. So both of them existed well before the last glacial period. But when the shoreline recently retreated 15 kilometres eastwards, they were not left as standing bodies of water. So the lakes pre-existed, but when the shoreline was 15k out to sea, they were not left as bodies of water, rather they were dry basins. They were drained by channels that cut into the floor of the basins. Smiths Lake drained to the east in much the same spot as where the modern lake does periodically drain to sea, and Myall Lake drained southwards largely as the modern lake does too. 12,000 years BP, sands on the inner barrier were being reworked under strong prevailing westerly winds, the same continent-wide prevailing winds that were blowing up the clay dunes at Gorin. But sea level recovered and returned to its sea level about 6,500 years ago. The outer barrier was built. There's a small little swampy area in between the inner and outer, and Smiths and Myall lakes were returned to their roughly their current dimensions. The initial burst of the building of those barriers was replaced about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago by another surge of wind-blown activity on the dunes, but this time the winds were from the southwest to the southeast, much as they are today. So through that last glacial maximum period, super dry, super cold, howling westerly winds the whole time. As sea level returned with temperatures rising again, the winds changed direction and were coming up from roughly where they do today. There's been no sign of further building of the dunes since then. There have been surges of activity behind the open ocean beaches. Looking quickly at the vegetation types in the area, we'd be familiar with the diversity here ranging from eucalypt angophora forests to melaleuca forests, leptospermum, banksia thickets and coastal salt marsh. Their distribution is strongly influenced by drainage, and it's likely to have waxed and waned as the drainage patterns and conditions changed with the geomorphic processes as the sea level returned to its present spot. Looking ahead, newly rising sea level, because it is rising again, with potential reactivation of that outer barrier and flooding of the back barrier swamps, is a potential stressor for all those vegetation types, possibly excluding the eucalypt angophora forests, which are a bit higher up. But all of those other communities, as the sea level continues rising, it will be drainage that stresses those communities and will determine their survival going forward. So the third site that I want to look at is right up in the centre of our axis, Barrington Tops. Probably, again, most of you will have some familiarity with the area. Excluding the swamps, the main vegetation formations in the Barrington Tops area today are subalpine grassland, Eucalyptus pauciflora or snow gum open forests, fastigata, Eucalyptus fastigata forests, and probably everybody's favourite is the Nothofagus morii forest, the Antarctic beech forest. Nothofagus morii, commonly called Antarctic beech, is an iconic tree, and there are very impressive stands of this tree at Gloucester Tops and Barrington Tops. Why it's called Antarctic beech is a bit of a puzzle, because there are other beech species which grow much further south than these ones, but that is what they're commonly known as. The vegetation histories for the area have been established by through pollen analysis undertaken by my colleague John Dodson and me at several sites up on the top. Today I want to focus on two sites which I've studied in detail: Horse Swamp, which is fairly high up at an altitude of 1,250 metres, and Top Swamp at 1,530 metres. That's the highest swamp up on the tops. The areas of these high altitude swamps at Barrington are extremely valuable as a resource for the study of environmental change, because the accumulated peat deposits they contain act like time capsules, preserving an accessible record of changes in the vegetation and the hydrological conditions there stretching back 10,000 years and more. And when I say detailed, I mean detailed. I'll show you some of it shortly. And the palynological, now I'm stumbling over it, palynological studies provide us with a far more detailed view of the vegetation dynamics than what we can infer from the geomorphic histories at Gorin and Myall. The methodology involved taking core samples of the peat and sediment in the swamps, carbon dating the materials at successive depths in the cores, and then extracting samples of the pollen grains that are preserved in the sediment. This is the first of the sites that I'll talk about. This is Horse Swamp. It looks very bleached because that's taken in winter and it's of course very frosted. There are two halves to Horse Swamp. This is the northern half. I chose that site for study because the southern site receives drainage from this one, so there were questions about whether it might have been reworked. But because this is a small enclosed basin, there is no stream running into it. So we don't have to worry about a little rivulet running through and churning everything up. And the peat sediment can just slowly accumulate in there. The core samples are obtained by using what's called a D-sampler. Where's my pointer? The core is just that little bit there. The light grey, bluey coloured clay at the bottom is the basal sediments, and then this is the peat. That's the stuff we're looking for, sitting above the basal clays. The coring instrument's basically a cylindrical tube, but on the D-sampler it has this wing sticking out from it. So when the core is pushed down into the sediment, you rotate it, and because the wing can't turn as you're rotating it, it opens a gate on one side of the cylinder, and then when you twist it the other way, the cylinder slices into the sediment and cuts a D-shaped section. Rotate it back again, and it closes the door so you can pull it up. The reason for using, well, it's simple, but it's clever. And the reason for using this is if I just pushed the tube down into the sediment and pulled it back up again, the core, as it's coming up again, scrapes all the side. So it gets contaminated. And it's so easy when you're talking about microscopic things like pollen grains to contaminate it. So we need to use this type of a coring device to seal the chamber before we pull it back up. Now, by identifying and counting the pollen types at each level, we can construct a picture of how the surrounding vegetation was changing over time. This little beauty is a pollen grain. As I said to Isabel when we were putting this together, I said, look, I'm sorry, it's not very photogenic, but if you'd been buried in a peat bog for 10,000 years, you'd be looking a bit like one of those bog men from Europe as well. I've chosen this pollen grain because it is a nothofagus. This is a grain of the Antarctic beach. And every pollen grain looks slightly different. This is the nothofagus pollen. It's hard to say the magnification because of the projection and everything, but it's probably about 500 times as we're looking at it now, the projection. Other commonly found ones up there to give you an idea of the variation is a grass pollen is quite spherical. It's a smooth sphere with one prominent pore on it. A eucalyptus pollen is like a three-cornered hat. So they are all quite distinctive and enable us to identify the species they came from. But the method involved counting, fairly tedious process. We extract the pollen from samples down the core taken at 5 centimetre intervals, and through putting it through a range of chemical processes and centrifuging, you get a little drop that contains thousands of pollen grains, fossilised pollen grains in it, plonk it on a microscope slide, and then you sit for hours on end counting and identifying the pollen types. You take the first 200 grains in the sample. So it's a sample of 200, and you clock the relative frequency of each pollen type until you hit 200. And then you move on to the next sample 5 centimetres lower than that and do the same thing again. This, of course, is the Nothofagus tree that produced that pollen. I think most of you will recognise it and know what a majestic tree they are. There'll be more about the Nothofagus forest shortly. This is, well, it's just called a pollen diagram. I'll explain what it is. I know that those of you up the back of the room won't be able to see the detail in it, but I'll just try to explain how it works. This is the pollen diagram for horse swamp. This is the depth going down here in the core. These bars are where we've got successful carbon dates, so we know how old it is. And as you go down the core, it's getting older and older until we get to the basal sediments, and we couldn't date that because there was no carbon material in it. There was no peat and no charcoal in it. The lines here are plotting down the column the frequency of different pollen types. The first 5 centimetres, or could be 20 there, I think 20 centimetres, and no records because it was all unconsolidated and wet and sloppy. We couldn't sample it. We did do a surface sample though, so the very top row is showing the relative frequencies of things there today. But going back to the first samples we could do, this was the proportion of eucalyptus, this was the proportion of Nothofagus, and then we went to various species across the column. So if we went to the first carbon date there, we could say, well, okay, wow, there's a peak of eucalyptus there. There is no Nothofagus, and then we can see what's happening with the other species. This big thing over here is Dixonia, a tree fern. And this is a water plant as well. So I'm sorry that, the detail there is too fine for you to discern, the specifics, but hopefully you'll get the gist of the way it works and the way we count it down. So that the middle swamp, the middle date there, 7,300 years, which is this one here, allows us to say, for instance, 7,300 years ago, a big drop in eucalypts, right? And still no Nothofagus. So when the deposit well, first of all, our basal sediments here are 10,750 years. Earlier than that, the site wasn't favourable to accumulate organic material, although we could have lost earlier cycles through erosion, of course. I should have mentioned with the dates, because carbon dates can be a bit contentious, what we did was sent the samples to multiple labs. We used labs at Sydney University, New South Wales Uni, and in California, and sometimes we would split the same sample and send one to one lab half to one lab, half to another lab, and check that they got the same results. So that's the way we can, verify the integrity of our dating. Now, when the older sediments here at Horse Swamp were deposited, eucalyptus and poaceae, the grasses, dominated the surrounding vegetation, and that continued until about 7,300 years ago, when they fell to their lowest values recorded. The swamp dried out considerably, and the tree ferns that I showed you, Dixonia antarctica, that's I think it's the soft tree fern, invaded what was a swamp. So it's still moist enough for ferns, but no, not moist enough for sphagnum moss and so on. Interestingly, some very recent studies done on the lakes on Kagari in southeast Queensland found a strong drying event there as well from 7,500 years ago. So roughly the same time, Barrington drying out, Kagari drying out. I'm going to encourage these Queensland people to explore that a bit more, because they may be picking up quite a regional change here. But from about 1600 years ago, there's been establishment of the present open forest at Horse Swamp, with over there, if you can just make it out, that's the eucalypts. The next row down is Nothofagus. So just that most recent period, the Nothofagus was appearing at Horse Swamp. That indicates more cool temperate rainforest in the region. Other shrubs like Pomaderus increased there at the same time, suggesting slightly wetter conditions. I want to look now quickly at the second swamp. This is Top Swamp. They are close to real colours. The swamp is sort of a bleached coppery red colour, and all the snow gums around it being white. As I said, this is the highest swamp up at Barrington Tops, but the base of the sediment here was dated as only 3,000 years ago, which is quite shallow. Now, why it would have not preserved peat older than 3,000 years ago, we don't know, but it's quite possible it could have been burnt out. If we have fires such as, just a few years ago, they were dotted all over Barrington Tops. Had the swamp been very dry, being peat, could have caught fire and burnt out, and then the wind just blows the ashes and dust away, and you've got to wait for conditions to return again. But we don't know. But it does have a good record of the vegetation at that high altitude over the last 3,000 years. So we've got 3 dates out of Top Swamp. 3,000 is the bottom one, midway 2,000, and higher up 1,500. Interestingly, that bottom one, the 3,000 date, is one where we did split the sample to verify the integrity of the dating. The most significant information obtained from the Top Swamp pollen diagram, and still you won't be able to read the detail, is again the appearance of Nothofagus. This is the eucalypts again, remember? Here is the Nothofagus appearing at Top Swamp. So recall that the bottom here is only 3,000 years ago. So only in the last 1,500 years has there been Nothofagus at Top Swamp. And that is the same time as it was first recorded at Horse Swamp. At the same time, we saw a decline in Casuarina, which we can't quite make out here. But those two things, Casuarina declining, Nothofagus appearing, suggests there's probably a more reliable or increased summer rainfall in the area. But the values for Nothofagus were too low to suggest that it grew in the immediate vicinity of the swamp. It was nearby. The forest was getting closer, but it was never quite there. So now I just want to run through a quick summary of the timeline of those key events, because I know I'm just standing here reeling off all these dates and numbers and ages and everything. But just as a quick summary, our oldest date was the 25,000 VP out at Gorin Lake. Dry conditions with an excess of evaporation over the lake inputs, so the lake got very salty. That wasn't quite the peak of the last glacial maximum. That occurred a bit later, 21 to 18,000 years ago. Cold and dry. Sea level 120 metres below the present. Shoreline at Mungo Brush and Seal Rocks 15 kilometres out to the east. 21,500 years ago, we had the clay dunes being built at Gorin Lake. Again, saline conditions, dry, strong westerly winds. 12,000 years ago, we had the sand in motion on the inner barrier around the Myall Lake system, still under those strong westerly winds. 8,500 years ago, no, we've missed one. 8,500 years ago, we had the clay dunes reactivated out at Gorin. 7,500 years ago, Horse Swamp dried up. 6,000 years ago, sea level had returned to its previous position. Temperatures had warmed. We've got the outer barriers being built up and down the coast. 5.5 to 4.5, dune instability, reworking all the sands. Then jumping ahead a fair bit, 1,500 years ago, we had Nothofagus pollen appearing at Top Swamp and Horse Swamp. Wetter conditions, more cool temperate rainforest nearby. 1,500, surge of aeolian wind-blown activity reworking the dunes along the coast, and since then more surges of wind-blown activity on the outer barrier. So that is just a quick snapshot of the information we've been able to glean from those sites about what have been the big picture changes of environmental conditions over what seems like a long time, 25,000 years. But, you know, for vegetation communities, that's a blink of an eye. It's nothing. But for human lifetime, it's an enormous stretch. So what insights can we draw from this history that help inform our conservation management work today? The two most important things are, firstly, that the environment is continuously changing at local, regional and national scales. We can't be certain what the primary drivers will be in the near to mid-term future, but rapidly increasing temperatures from an already high base, rising sea level, and more extreme events, including droughts, seem pretty much locked in. The second key insight from the environmental record is that recovery of vegetation and habitats following major changes in conditions has been through expansion of persisting areas rather than through recruitment over long distances. This makes the retention of refuges vitally important, and we need to manage them in a way that maximises their resilience. I hope Sean Hooper's presentation this afternoon will include some discussion of a range of Indigenous land management practices that could help build that resilience. What's different now, of course, is that over the long period I've focused on today, there was connectivity between vegetation areas, including those that formed the refuges. Now, following 200 years of land clearing for agriculture, that connectivity has been greatly reduced. Highly fragmented environments are especially vulnerable to events such as catastrophic fire or drought, because their recovery depends on re-establishment from surviving areas of similar vegetation. This is on my property, a good year, bad year. We're heading back to this again now. And all of us in the room here are only too familiar with I said drought is a major challenge, more so than temperatures. I think in the short to mid-term, vegetation communities here are not so much temperature dependent as they are on the moisture balance. But moisture balance can determine the survival or loss of species, because if there is a winnowing effect because of drought and some things don't pull through, the history is telling us you can't rely on recruitment from the northern rivers where things might be surviving unless someone buys it and plants it here, because they can't travel that far. It has to be very localised. The other traumatic catastrophic effect we're all too familiar with in this area is fire. Can have the same thing, wipe out a whole remnant community. You may be able to just make out the name of the town on that roadside there. It's pointing the way to Taree. Just repeating that the highly fragmented environments are so vulnerable to events such as these, because their recovery depends on establishment from surviving areas of similar vegetation. Now, in this region, much of the wooded grassland has been cleared, but we're fortunate to still have extensive areas of forest of many types remaining. But particularly around the perimeter of those areas, some habitats are now largely reduced to small islands. They don't need to be immediately connected to function as insurance populations or as part of a corridor for the movement of fauna, but there is a limit to the distance the birds and flying foxes and so on can carry the fruit and seeds. This limited mobility is demonstrated, I think, by another iconic tree species in our region, Podocarpus elatus, or the plum pine. Trees on my property at Craven, some of which are around 500 years old, have been found to be of a genotype that isn't known from any other location. So it seems there is no exchange with populations at Mungo Brush, Pacific Palms and Harrington, only 55 kilometres away. So to wrap up, the history of change highlights the critical importance of building the resilience of the environments we're now managing and taking steps to maintain or increase the connectivity between the environments at local and regional levels. As conditions changed at Barrington, the different vegetation types contracted, expanded and moved around. They didn't just pop up out of thin air. The key to their persistence was refuges, continuity and scale. When it became too cold and dry for Nothofagus to survive in some parts of the plateau, it grew well in others and then provided a source population for re-establishment when conditions warmed again. The analogy today is that as conditions change, either through progressive warming or the short-term catastrophic events such as fires, the presence of connected or nearly connected populations will very largely determine whether a vegetation community community survives at the local or even the regional level. In this regard, many of you will be familiar with the proposal by AWC, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, to establish a conservation precinct comprising a loose network of privately owned properties that are managed for conservation and anchored by the Wallenbach Sanctuary near Stroud. It's still being developed, but that approach might serve as a model for initiatives elsewhere in the region. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry if that's too much detail, but happy to take questions or talk to you later. It was the subject of a lot of debate for a long time, but I think the consensus now is that no, it wasn't. There was a thought that when it rebounded 6,500 years ago, maybe briefly, it went above a bit and dropped back, but I think that idea is now dropped. So it's as high now. I'm not talking geologic timescales here, just 100,000 years. No, it's as high now as it has ever been, which is why the renewed rise, measured in, we've all heard the figures, a centimetre a decade or something. It sounds like nothing, but that's about 10 times faster than what the most recent return was. So it won't worry any of us, but it will dramatically change the natural environments in the area. It was acting like an evaporation pond. So the water running into it with dissolved salts and sediments and then evaporating, gradually concentrating. Even today, if you dig a hole down there, the salinities are greater than seawater. It was highly saline. Yeah, it was hiding in refuge areas on the south and east flanks of the plateau. It's still growing there today, and in fact that's probably where some of the core areas are today, but it had been more extensive but had to shrink back down to that moister environment there, because remember the winds had been coming from the west, which is why the southeast was a good sheltered location for it. And it, again, well, it's called Antarctic Beach, but it's not temperature dependent. The cold temperatures wouldn't have worried it. It was dryness. So it needed the moisture. No, we had charcoal, but of course, just the presence of charcoal, you're drawing a very long bow to say, oh, it must have been indigenous burning, because it could have been bushfires. To distinguish between the two would be very difficult, I think. People look for peaks in Lake George near Canberra. There was a lot of work done there to try to see whether they could pick up a spike in charcoal at the presumed time of indigenous occupation of the area. There was some tenuous evidence of that, but really the big peaks in charcoal almost everywhere have been from European burning, not indigenous burning, because the indigenous burning would have been much more limited in area, more controlled, cool burns. It was the early colonists who did the real fire stick farming by burning everything to the ground so they could plant pasture. Yeah, well, I think the main deposit of deposits of rutile were in one of those barriers that had all been pushed up. So the present day coastline is you've got the beach and the dunes behind there with spinifex and things growing on it. But then the higher dunes behind that were what were pushed up in the sea level rise, And that's where the rutile was, because the rutile had been spread across the coastal plain and then pushed back up. Yes. I think that larger distribution of it does date back way beyond the time frame that I've been looking at. But what the Barrington Top sites have shown us is that the recovery of the beech forest there after that last very difficult period was entirely dependent on recovery from surviving patches. There was no recruitment from other populations up near the border ranges. Exactly the same with the plum pine, the podocarpus. Just because it is all up and down the coast, that can date back to Gondwana times. You know, that's millions of years. In the sort of time scales that we can, you know, conceive of, there hasn't been that exchange of materials between those populations. So it underscores how vulnerable all of them are, that without preserving or trying to build more resilience and connectivity, a catastrophic event could take out the Gloucester tops nothofagus, and it probably wouldn't come back. So high vulnerability. Look, over very long time frames, yes. But again, if we look at these two species, the nothofagus, which only goes up, I think border ranges is about the limit, but the podocarpus grows all the way up to almost to Cairns, I think. But when you look at the genetics of those stands up and down the coast, there are some commonalities, but a lot of the genetics are quite distinct. As I mentioned, the ones at Craven are genetically different even from the ones here at Harrington. And that's only as the bat flies 50 kilometres or so. So I think we've always assumed that there would be a recruitment or a repopulation from those surviving sources, but it's much more constrained than we had previously thought. Yeah. Well, yeah, well, you're absolutely right. And on a couple of fronts, if I can just follow those leads, the change of wind direction certainly does, you know, affect your tidal movements and so on. And it was the winds, when they moved around to start coming back from the southeast primarily, they were a large part of what was pushing the sand up to form what we now call that outer barrier. So it was the winds as well as the tides pushing that all up. But of course, it wasn't just the westerly winds lowered the sea, because there was an awful lot of ocean water frozen in ice in Antarctica, and that lowered it pretty dramatically. But yeah, the wind direction, that change of direction, while ever we had the westerly winds, you were not going to have beach dunes building up along the Myall Lakes, that's for sure.